The last thing I smelled the first time I died wasn't smoke. It was the dish I never got to plate. That's the strange mercy and the strange cruelty of a great nose. It keeps working right up until the end, and at the end it doesn't show you the truth. It shows you the thing you lost. I was 35 years old, asleep in the back room of a failing diner on the wrong side of a city that had stopped needing me, and somewhere out front a gas line that should have been replaced a decade ago was filling the building with the smell of nothing, which is the only smell gas really has, an absence dressed up as a warning. And here is the bitter joke of my whole first life, the one I've turned over in my hands across 2 lifetimes since. I had the best nose in my graduating class. Chef Vasseur used to say, I could smell a thought. And I didn't smell the gas, because by 35 I had spent 15 years deliberately deadening the one sense that had ever made me special, because every time it woke up it reminded me of what I'd given away. A great nose is a curse when you've thrown away the only thing it was for. So I'd shut it down, year by year, breath by breath, until the night it might have saved my life and it had nothing left to tell me. But in the last half second, as the dark came up, it woke. The nose woke. And it didn't show me gas or smoke or fear. It showed me the dish, my dish, the braise, the one I'd been born to cook and never got to present, the smell of it rising up out of nowhere as bright and complete as if it were on the pass in front of me, the deep wine-dark richness of it, the time, the long, slow sweetness of something cooked for 6 hours with love by a girl who still believed she was allowed to want things. I died smelling the dish I gave away. And I want you to hold that image because everything that comes after is the story of how I got the chance to cook it after all. And then I opened my eyes and the smell was still there, but it was real and it was coming from a pot in front of me and I was 19. Let me tell you who I was before any of it, because you can't understand what I did at the end unless you understand where the cooking came from, and it didn't come from a school. It came from a diner. My father ran a 12-stool greasy spoon on a corner the city forgot. The kind of place where the coffee was bad and the regulars were lonely and the whole operation ran on one flat-top griddle and my dad's 2 tired hands. My mother left when I was small. I don't remember her, and I've made my peace with that. What I remember is the diner. I grew up in that diner, on a milk crate by the pass so I could see over the counter, and I learned to cook the way you learn to breathe, without anyone deciding to teach you. My dad couldn't afford a babysitter, so the kitchen was my babysitter, and the kitchen raised me right. By 8, I could run the griddle. By 12, I understood, in a way I couldn't have explained, that food was a language and that my dad spoke it fluently in a single dialect, diner food, honest and cheap and made with care, and that I had been born already knowing the grammar of something bigger. And I had the nose. That was the thing nobody could account for, the thing that didn't come from the diner or from anywhere I could name. I could smell what a dish needed the way other people can see that a picture's crooked. I could taste a sauce and tell you the 4 things wrong with it, and the one thing that would fix all 4. It was a freakish, useless gift in a 12-stool diner where the menu was eggs and hash, and my dad knew it was freakish. And my dad, God bless him, he never had $1 to spare in his life, scraped and saved and worked doubles for 2 years to send me to the LaCroix Culinary Institute on the half scholarship I'd won. Because he looked at his strange daughter, who could smell a thought, and he understood that the diner was too small a room for what I was. Let me tell you about my dad, because he's the warm beating center of this whole thing, and you need to feel him to understand what was at stake. He was a quiet man, worn down by a hard life and a wife who'd left and a business that never quite made it, and he loved me with a fierceness that never once announced itself in words. It lived entirely in actions, in the doubles he worked, in the way he saved his tips in a coffee can marked run that I wasn't supposed to know about, in the milk crate he set by the pass when I was small so I could watch him cook and feel, in a kitchen, like I belonged somewhere. He never told me he was proud of me. He just spent every dollar and every spare hour of his exhausted life proving it. When my LaCroix acceptance came, he didn't celebrate loudly. He just stood in the kitchen holding the letter with his rough hands, and his eyes went bright, and he said the thing I've carried through 2 lifetimes. You're not staying on this corner, Ren. I didn't raise a griddle cook. I raised whatever the hell you are. That's the kindest and truest thing anyone ever said to me. And in my first life, I repaid it by coming home to that same corner with my gift in a box and dying there. The one outcome that would have broken his heart. the proof that the doubles and the coffee can and the milk crate had all been for nothing. The thing I most needed to fix in my second life wasn't the stage or the revenge. It was that. It was making the doubles count. The dish I was born to cook came from that diner too. It was a braise, beef cheeks, the cheap cut, the cut nobody wanted, cooked low and slow for 6 hours in red wine and aromatics until the toughness surrendered into something that fell apart at the touch of a spoon. My dad made a rough version of it on the diner's flat top as a Sunday special, the one fancy thing he did, and I spent my years at LaCroix taking that humble Sunday braise and refining it, lifting it, until it was the most sophisticated thing on any plate in the building while still tasting, at its heart, like my father's tired hands on a Sunday afternoon. That braise was me. The whole of me. The poor kid who took the cheapest cut and the humblest dish and made judges go quiet. That was my entire artistic soul on a plate. Remember the braise. It's where this whole story begins and ends. And then there was Theo Marchetti, and I learned that a girl can be born with a gift the gatekeepers would kill for and still hand it over to the family that gatekept her and call it love. The Marchettis were a dynasty. If you don't know the food world, you'll have to take my word for what that means. They were a name, 3 generations of celebrated restaurants, the kind of family whose surname on a reservation got you the good table and whose surname on a culinary school application got you in regardless of what you could actually do. Theo was the son, handsome, easy, charming in the specific way of people who have never once had to earn a room because they were born already standing in the best one. He noticed me in our first year, the scholarship girl with the freak nose and the diner-stained hands, and a poor kid from a forgotten corner does not have many defenses against the warmth of the golden boy of the most famous family in her field deciding she's special. We started dating. I thought I'd been let in. I'd been recruited. Here's the thing about Theo that took me dying to understand. Theo did not love me exactly. Theo loved that the girl from the diner could taste a sauce and fix it, could look at a dish and know what it needed, could take the humblest ingredients and make the judges weep. And Theo, who had grown up surrounded by reputation and short on talent, understood from very early that my gift was a resource, and that a resource in the hands of a Marchetti was simply a Marchetti asset. He never put it that way. He put it in kisses and praise, and I don't know what I'd do without you, and the warm, intoxicating sense that I, the outsider, had been adopted into the most glamorous family in the room. But underneath the warmth, Theo was always, quietly, deploying me. And the thing he was deploying me toward, all year long, was his sister. Bianca Marchetti was the family's anointed heir, and Bianca Marchetti could not cook. I want to be careful and fair here because Bianca was, in her own way, a victim of the same machine that nearly destroyed me, raised to be the golden girl, handed the family name and the judge's favor and the assumption of brilliance, and never once required to actually be brilliant, so that by the time she reached LaCroix she was a young woman with an enormous reputation and a very small amount of skill, terrified every single day that someone would notice the gap. The family's solution to Bianca's gap was, increasingly, me. Theo would bring me Bianca's dishes to fix. He'd ask me, sweetly, to help her plate, which meant recook the thing entirely while she watched. All year I quietly elevated Bianca Marchetti's work, laundered my freak gift through her famous hands, because Theo asked me to, because it made me feel like family, because a girl who grew up on a milk crate by the pass will do almost anything for the feeling of belonging to the people who own the room. And the room was the prize. I should explain the stakes because they were everything. LaCroix's final practical exam, the single most important day of the program, determined who won the one thing every student there was secretly killing for, the apprenticeship at Maison Sorel. Sorel was a legend, the restaurant, 3 stars, and a 40-year reputation, and each year it took exactly one LaCroix graduate as a stagiaire, and that one placement was the difference between a real career and a lifetime of line cooking somebody else's vision. For a Marchetti, it was a nice to have. For me, the diner kid with no name and no connections, it was the only door. There was no other way in for someone like me. You won the Sorel stage on final practical day, or you went back to the corner the city forgot. The judges scored each dish, and there was a cutoff, and the top score took Sorel, and there was no second day and no next year for a graduating student, because after final practical the door closed, and the gatekeepers went back to keeping their gate. The morning of the final practical in my first life, Theo came to me with the ask he'd been building toward all year. Bianca needs the sorrel stage, he said, and I can still hear the exact shape of it, the way it wasn't even framed as a question. The family's expecting it. You don't understand the pressure she's under, what it means for her not to get it. And here's the thing, Ren. You don't need it. You're going to be brilliant no matter where you start, everybody knows that. But for Bianca, this is everything. And then the ask, the one that is the title of my whole story, delivered with the warm certainty of a man who had never once been refused. Give your exam dish to my sister. The judges already love her. A dish like yours under her name. She's a lock. She clears the cut easy. You cook her plate, she presents it, she gets sorrel. You can find another way in. Family takes care of family. Do this for us. The judges already love her. You can find another way in. I want you to hear both lies, because together they're the whole murder weapon. There was no other way in. I was a scholarship kid with no name. Sorrel was the way, the only way. And the judges already love her. Was true only in the way that a halo is true. They loved the Marchetti name, the reputation, the assumption. But the judges scored food, and Bianca's actual food, standing on its own, was nowhere near the cut. The only thing that could carry Bianca over the line was my dish, wearing her name. Theo either knew that and was asking me to launder my entire future into his sister's reputation, or he didn't bother to know, and I've spent 2 lifetimes deciding which is worse. But the deepest thing in the ask, the thing I couldn't see at 19, was this. Theo wasn't asking me to help his sister. He was asking me to disappear my own gift so that his family's reputation could keep being true. He needed Bianca to win on my talent so that the Marchetti story, that the name and the brilliance went together, would survive one more generation. I was the secret ingredient that kept the lie tasting real. And he was asking me, with a kiss on the forehead, to pour my whole self into a dish that would have somebody else's name on it, and to call that family, and to call it love. And I did it. God forgive the girl I did it. On the most important day of my life, I cooked my braise, my soul, my father's Sunday special lifted to the heavens, and I plated it beautifully, and I let Bianca Marchetti carry it to the pass and present it to the judges as her own. I remember the exact moment in that first life when I knew what I'd done. I was standing at my own station with an empty plate in front of me. I'd given Bianca the braise and cobbled together some safe, forgettable nothing for myself, because I'd used my one real dish on her, and I watched her walk my food to the pass, my 6 hours, my whole soul, and I watched the judges taste it and go still, that beautiful stillness I'd worked my whole life to cause. And I watched them write down a top score next to the name Marchetti. And I stood there at my empty station and felt the thing I'd done settle over me like cold grease. I had just watched the best work of my life win the only prize that mattered, for someone else, in front of the people whose respect I'd been starving for since I was a kid on a milk crate. The stillness on the judges' faces was the stillness I'd dreamed of my whole life, and it was pointed at the wrong name, and I'd pointed it there myself, with a smile, because a boy I loved told me family takes care of family. I didn't cry. I told myself it was fine, told myself I was generous, told myself there'd be another way in. There was no other way in. There was just a diner kid standing at an empty station watching her own soul win someone else's future, and that is the image of my first self I most needed to come back and correct. And the judges who scored food, scored it at the top, and Bianca Marchetti won the Maison Sorrel stage on the back of a diner kid's braise. And I, having spent my one dish, my one shot, my whole self, on someone else's name, presented nothing of my own that could win, and I did not get sorrel, and the door closed and the gatekeepers went back to keeping their gate. There was no other way in. I tried. For years I tried, line cooking in kitchens that would never let a no-name rise, watching dishes I could have improved go out wrong because the chef outranked me, and rank was the only thing that mattered in rooms that had no sorrel stage on my resume to make them listen. Let me stay in those kitchens a moment, because the slow death of a gift is the worst thing I know how to describe, and I lived it for 15 years. The thing about a kitchen with a strict brigade is that talent without rank is not just useless, it's punished. I would smell that a sauce had broken before the saucier did, would know that a braise needed an hour more, and I learned, fast and hard, that to say so was to be slapped down for stepping above my station. So I stopped saying so. I stopped smelling. You can do that. It turns out you can teach a great nose to stop reporting, the way you can teach a dog to stop barking, by punishing it every time it tries. And a cook who has trained herself not to notice what food needs is no longer a cook. She's a pair of hands that follows orders. I became a very good pair of hands. I worked faster stations in worse places, and the gift folded up smaller and smaller inside me, and the part of me that used to taste a sauce and light up went quiet, and then went dark, and I told myself that was just growing up, just being realistic, just what happens to everyone who dreamed too big. And Theo, of course, drifted. Within a year of the family getting what it needed, the golden boy had outgrown the diner girl. I'd served my purpose. The asset had been deployed, and he moved on to people who fit the Marchetti life better. He didn't even do it cruelly. He just stopped calling, stopped reaching. The warmth simply switched off now that there was nothing left to deploy. I gave away my one door for a boy who wasn't even there a year later, and the symmetry of it still makes me laugh, a hard laugh with no joy in it. I'd traded my whole future for a relationship that didn't survive the very season I sacrificed it for. And eventually I went home. To my dad's diner, the 12-stool greasy spoon that was supposed to be too small a room for what I was, the room he'd worked doubles for 2 years to get me out of. I came back to it at 31 with my gift in a box and ran the griddle beside my aging father, and I told myself it was fine, told myself I was helping him, and the truth was that I had nowhere else to go, and nothing left to be. The gift rotted on the corner the city forgot. And at 35, in the small hours of a Tuesday, a gas line that my dad couldn't afford to replace, and I'd stopped being able to smell let go in the night, and I died in the one room my father had tried so hard to get me out of, asleep in the back, smelling, at the very last, when the deadened nose finally woke too late to save me, the braise I gave away. And then I woke up 19, at my station in the LaCroix prep kitchen, the smell of my own braise rising out of the pot in front of me, real, alive mine. I nearly dropped my spoon. You try waking up inside a 19-year-old body you buried at 35, mid-stir, with the smell of the dish you died grieving rising up real and warm into your face. The kitchen swam. The clatter and heat of the prep room reassembled around me, the line of students at their stations, and a guy beside me, Ravi, my prep station neighbor, a fellow scholarship kid with a quick mouth and a good heart, my closest friend in the program until in my first life I let that friendship die along with everything else, glanced over and said, "You good, Calloway? You went somewhere for a second there." And I started laughing, this cracked, unsteady laugh, because the smell was so real, and I was so alive, and Ravi had no idea he was talking to a dead woman, and I looked down at my own young hands and the pot and the calendar on the wall, and the date assembled itself, and I understood. It was 4 days before the final practical. I was 19, at my station, with the nose still sharp and the braise in the pot, and the gift still whole and unrotted. 4 days before the morning Theo would ask me to give my dish away. And this time I knew every step of the trap, because I'd already cooked my way into it once with my own 2 hands. I did not cry. I'll be straight with you, the way a hot kitchen teaches you to be straight, because the soft version of this has me weeping with gratitude, and the real version is harder. What I felt, standing at that station with the smell of my own braise in my face, was the cold, clean clarity of a cook who has plated the most important dish of her life under someone else's name and just been handed, against every law of the universe, the chance to put her own name back on it. The disorientation took a few days to wear off, and I won't pretend it didn't, because the stories never tell you about the strangeness of coming back. I kept reaching for the aches of a 35-year-old body and finding a 19-year-old's instead, light and quick and unbroken. I kept flinching at people I knew the whole sad futures of, Ravi, who in my other life would drift away, Chef Vasseur, whose face would go shut with disappointment, my dad, 2 bus rides away, working doubles for a daughter who'd let him down. I kept having to stop myself from talking to all of them like a woman who'd lost them years ago, which I had. And the nose. The nose was the strangest part because it had been dead so long that having it back, wide open and reporting everything, was almost overwhelming, like a person who's been in a dark room walking out into noon. For about a week the whole world was too loud with smell, every spice and sear and steam of the prep kitchen flooding in, and I half expected, every time I closed my eyes, to open them back in the dark of the diner with the gas rising. But the braise was real in the pot every morning, and the nose stayed open, and slowly the strangeness burned off and left the hard certainty underneath that this was not a dream and not a mercy I'd earned, just a window thrown open one more time, for days before it would slam, and that I was not going to waste it dizzy. I had a dish to plate. More than that, I had a gift to dig back out of the box I'd buried it in, and a father's doubles to finally make count. And underneath the clarity, lower down, was something close to joy, because I could smell again. The nose was back, wide open, undeadened, catching everything. The caramel edge of the onions on the next station, the thyme in my own pot, the metal and steam smell of a working kitchen that I had loved before I learned to be afraid of it. Even if Sorrel had been gone forever, I think I'd have wept just to have my own senses returned to me. The revenge, whatever it became, was going to run second to that. The first thing was that I could taste the world again. Everything else came from refusing, this time, to give my gift away. The 4 days before the final practical were strange and vivid, and the strangest part was all of them being alive again. Theo, golden and careless and not yet exposed, Bianca, anointed and afraid, Chef Vasseur prowling the line, Ravi at his station, my dad, 2 bus rides away, working doubles to keep his strange daughter at the school that was supposed to save her. I moved through those 4 days like a cook walking a kitchen she's worked 1,000 services in, knowing where every burn and slick is, except the kitchen was my own life and the burns were the places it had scarred. I went to Chef Vasseur first. Not strategy, something closer to homage. Soline Vasseur had come up the way I had, from nothing, a woman who'd clawed her way into a field that gate-kept people like us with both hands, and she had never once in her career made her peace with the Marchettis of the world. She'd seen the laundering. I understand now that she'd been watching it happen all year, the diner girl's gift quietly flowing into the Marchetti girls' plates, and in my first life, she'd watched me hand Bianca my braise on final practical day, and something in her face had gone shut and disappointed, and she'd never quite looked at me the same after, because she'd been waiting for me to have the spine to refuse, and I hadn't. So on the first day of my second life, I found her after service, and I told her, plainly, on final practical, whatever anyone asks of me, I'm cooking my own dish under my own name. The braise.
Meaning?
She looked at me with those hard assessing eyes, the eyes of a woman who had been disappointed by talented students more times than she could count, and she was quiet a moment, and then she said, "Something's different about you this week, Calloway." And I said, "Yeah." And she didn't ask what, because she wasn't a woman who needed the inside of things explained, and she just gave a short, hard nod and said, "Good. Because I'll tell you something I don't say to students. The only thing this whole rotten business respects is a plate it can't argue with. Names get you in the door. A plate that's true is the only thing that survives the room. Cook the true thing.
Put your name on it.
Make them choke on it." She didn't know she was describing the exact shape of my death and my resurrection. I never told her, but I've carried that sentence into every kitchen since. A plate that's true is the only thing that survives the room. I cooked beside her those 4 days with my eyes fully open for the first time in either life, and it changed how I cooked. In my first life, I'd been a gifted student who half believed, somewhere underneath, that the gift wasn't really mine to keep, that a scholarship kid's job was to be useful to the people who actually own the rooms, and that my talent was a kind of rent I paid for being allowed inside. You cook differently when you carry that. You hold something back. You leave the best of yourself off the plate, because some part of you suspects the best of yourself was never meant to have your name on it. This time I held nothing back. I cooked every prep dish those 4 days like it was the final practical, full out, no hedging, and Chef Vasseur noticed. She noticed everything, and on the 3rd day she stopped at my station, tasted a sauce I was working without asking, and went still for a second, and then said, "Lo, where has this been, Calloway? You've been cooking like you were apologizing for taking up a burner all year. This is the first time I've tasted you cook like you meant it." And I said, "I figured out it was mine to keep. That's all. I finally figured out the gift was mine." She held my eyes a long beat, the hard eyes that had been disappointed by talented students more times than she could count, and then she nodded slowly and said, "Most people figure that out after the door's already closed on them." She had no idea how exactly right she was, that for me the door had closed a whole life and a death ago, and I'd been handed the rarest thing in the world, the chance to learn the lesson while the door was still open. I was not going to waste the knowing the way I'd wasted the not knowing. I did not break up with Theo in those 4 days, and people always ask me why. The answer runs underneath this whole story, because a breakup was a scene, and a scene was a thing Theo could win. He was magnificent at being wounded. He could turn any confrontation into a drama where he was the injured party and I was the ungrateful outsider biting the family that fed her, and he'd reach for me with that warmth, and I had a lifetime of being reachable. The one move he had no answer to was a girl who simply, quietly, was no longer available to be spent. So I gave him nothing to push against. I was warm, I was his, and inside I was a sealed kitchen he couldn't get into, and I let him walk toward the final practical with no idea that the secret ingredient he'd been counting on had quietly, permanently, taken herself off his menu. I want to say something about Bianca, too, because she's part of this, and I've thought hard about how to be fair to her. In those 4 days, I watched her the way you watch someone when you already know how their story ends, and what I saw, with my second life eyes, was not a villain but a frightened young woman in a beautifully made trap. Bianca had been handed the family name and the judge's favor and the assumption of brilliance, and never once been required to actually be good, and the result was that she lived in a permanent low-grade terror of being found out, because somewhere underneath the halo she knew she couldn't really cook. She knew the dishes that cleared her bars weren't hers. And there's a particular cruelty in that, in being set up to be exposed, in being protected from competence until the protection becomes the thing that destroys you. I felt for her, genuinely. But, and this is the part that kept my spine straight, she was also complicit. She took my labor all year and never once thanked me, never once acknowledged that the plates clearing her bars were cooked by the scholarship girl she was happy to treat as the help. She let me dismantle myself for her, and felt entitled to it, the way the protected always feel entitled to the labor of the unprotected. So I felt for her, and I refused to save her, and I've made my peace with the distance between those two things. You can pity someone and still decline to set yourself on fire to keep their lie warm. It took me dying to learn that those aren't the same thing. And I want to tell you about Ravi because he matters and because his thread is one of the quiet joys of my second life. Ravi was the other scholarship kid, the other outsider, and in my first life I'd let our friendship wither once Theo and the Marchetti orbit took up all my air, and I'd regretted it, lying cooking alone in joyless kitchens, that I'd traded the one friend who understood where I came from for a family that was only ever using me. So in my second life, those 4 days, I just enjoyed Ravi, his terrible impressions of the instructors, his ferocious, unfashionable love of unglamorous food, the way he and I spoke the same first language of people who'd grown up watching a parent work too hard for too little. At one point he said, sideways, scrubbing a pan, "You seem like yourself this week. The real one. Not the version that goes quiet whenever a Marchetti walks in." And I laughed, and he narrowed his eyes and said, "You're the best cook in this building, Ren. You know that, right? Not the one with the name. You. Don't let those people make you forget whose hands actually make the food." I didn't tell him I'd died, that I'd come back, that he was reaching me across a grave. I just bumped his shoulder with mine. He's the chef de cuisine at my restaurant now. Some of what I came back to save was never the stage at all. It was him. There's a thing Ravi said to me, years later, after we'd built the restaurant together, that I keep folded up and carry. We were closing down one night, the 2 scholarship kids who'd made it, scrubbing the line the way we used to scrub prep stations at LaCroix, and he said out of nowhere, "You know what I never understood? Back in school, that whole last week before finals, you changed, like, overnight. You went from this girl who'd jump every time a Marchetti snapped, to somebody who just couldn't be moved. I always wondered what happened to you that week." And I almost told him. The words were right there. I died, Ravi. I died at 35 in my dad's diner, and I came back and I knew exactly what was coming, and I refused to walk into it again. But I just said, I figured out what my hands were worth. That's all. And he nodded slowly, scrubbing, and said, "Whatever it was, it saved both of us. Because if you'd handed that braise over, I don't think I'd have had the guts to keep my own dish either." The whole room was watching you. When you walked yours to the pass under your own name, you made it okay for the rest of us to stop apologizing for taking up a burner. I never thought of it that way. But it's true. The scholarship kids that year all cooked a little braver after I kept my dish, as if one person refusing to launder herself gave everyone else permission to stand on their own plates. Sometimes the most important thing a no does isn't what it does to the person you said it to. It's what it does to everyone watching who didn't know they were allowed. The morning of the final practical arrived, exactly as I knew it would, and so did Theo, exactly as I knew he would, with the ask he'd built toward for a year. He found me at my station as I was setting up, and he put his hand on my waist, and his eyes were already soft with the certainty of my yes, and he said it. Ren, today's the day. Bianca needs this, you know what it means for her, for the family. Give your exam dish to my sister. The judges already love her. Your braise under her name, and she clears the cut easy. She gets sorrel. You'll find another way in. You're too good not to. Family takes care of family. Please, do this for us. I held my spoon, and I looked at my braise starting to come together in the pot. My dad's Sunday special. My soul. The dish I died smelling, and I felt the whole weight of 2 lives hang on what I said next. And I said, calm as a pilot light, no, Theo. I'm cooking my own dish, and I'm presenting it under my own name. Bianca can cook her own. If the judges love her as much as you say, she'll be fine on her own food. The silence that came back at me was a thing I'll remember as long as I have a tongue to taste with. He had never heard it from me. Not really. Not without a seam he could widen into a yes. And when he spoke again, the warmth had cooled into something truer and uglier. Are you serious right now? After everything my family's done for you? You'd let Bianca fail. You'd do that to her. To us, over a dish? You can find another way in, Ren. You always land on your feet. This is so selfish. And there it was, the trick, the way he turned my refusal to launder my own gift into my selfishness, the way he made keeping my own work look like cruelty. In my first life, that word, selfish, would have unmade me, because a girl who grew up an outsider will do almost anything not to be the ungrateful one. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I'd buried her in a diner fire at 35. So I said, gently, because gentle was the sharpest knife I had, Bianca can have my friendship, my notes, my help any day she wants it. What she can't have is my plate with her name on it. There's no other way in for me, Theo. There never was. You knew that. You just decided my one door mattered less than your family's reputation. And I turned back to my pot, and I did not give him my dish, and I cooked. Here's the part Theo never understood, the mechanism under the morning. And I'll lay it out plain because it's the engine of everything. In my first life, by giving Bianca my braise, I gave the Marchettis the one thing they couldn't manufacture, a true plate to put their name on. Bianca cleared the cut not because the judges loved her, but because she was carrying my food, and food doesn't care whose name is on the ticket. The moment I kept my own dish, the moment Bianca had to walk to the pass carrying her own actual cooking, the halo was suddenly standing alone, with nothing true underneath it, and the judges, who scored the plate and not the name, gave the plate exactly what it was worth. He hadn't asked me to help his sister. He'd asked me to be the truth under the lie. And the second I stopped being it, the lie had to stand on its own, and lies don't plate well. I'll tell you about my dish, because in my first life I cooked it for someone else's name, and cooking it under my own in my second was a resurrection with a spoon. The final practical was in LaCroix's main exam kitchen, 20 stations under hard bright light, the judges at a long pass at the front, 3 of them, and Chef Vasseur observing from the side with her arms folded. We had 4 hours. There's a thing that happens to me when I cook the braise, and it happened that morning, and I want to give it to you because it's the center of everything. The world goes quiet. The kitchen, the lights, the other students, the whole apparatus of a thing being judged, it all recedes, and there's only the pot, and the heat, and the long, slow conversation between me and the food, the conversation my dad taught me on a milk crate, and LaCroix only refined. I seared the cheeks until the smell of it bloomed dark and savory across my station. I built the braising liquid the way you'd build an argument, every element earning its place. The wine reduced to something serious, the aromatics sweated slow, the whole thing brought together, and then left alone to do the only thing that can't be rushed. Time. 6 hours of surrender, compressed by technique and a good oven into the window. I had the toughest, cheapest cut on the animal, slowly giving up its resistance and becoming tender, becoming generous, becoming the thing my father made on Sunday afternoons when the diner was closed, and it was just us. And as it cooked, the nose, my nose, wide open in this life, undeadened, alive, told me everything. A half degree too hot, pull it back. Needs acid, a hit of vinegar at the end to lift it. 1 more minute, now, lift it now. I cooked the whole dish by smell, the way I was born to, the gift I'd nearly let die, guiding my hands through the most important 4 hours of 2 lifetimes. And somewhere in the 3rd hour, the smell of it filled my whole station, the wine-dark depth, the time, the 6-hour sweetness, and I understood, with my hands moving and my nose wide open, and my whole self finally pouring into a plate that would carry my own name, that I was not merely going to pass. I was going to cook the best dish in the room. I plated it the way you'd write a love letter, every element placed with intention, the humble braise elevated to something that made the cheap cut look like a choice and not a compromise, and I carried it to the past myself, under my own name, Ren Calloway, the diner kid, and I set it down in front of the judges, and I watched them taste it. I watched the first judge go still, the particular stillness of a person who has just been told the truth by a plate of food. The second judge closed her eyes. The third looked up at me, this no-name scholarship girl, with something that was almost alarm, the alarm of a gatekeeper realizing the gate has just been walked through by someone who is never supposed to have the key. I scored at the very top. Not near it. At it. The braise won the Maison Sorel stage, under the name of the girl who'd actually cooked it, in the only life where she'd had the spine to keep it. Chef Vasseur was watching from the side, and when the judges set down their spoons, she didn't smile. She wasn't a smiler, but she gave me one short, hard nod across the kitchen, and I understood what was in it, because I'd waited a lifetime to earn it.
It said, "There."
That's the true plate. That's the thing they couldn't argue with.
You kept it this time.
And that nod was worth more to me than the score, because in my first life I'd made her go shut and disappointed, and in this one I'd made her right. 2 stations over and a whole world apart, Bianca Marchetti was learning what it costs to plate a halo with nothing true underneath it. With no one to carry her, she had to present her own actual dish, and her own actual dish, standing alone in front of judges who scored food and not names, was exactly what it had always been. Competent, anxious, unremarkable. The work of a young woman who'd been protected from ever having to be good. The judges tasted it the way they tasted everything, and they scored it the way it deserved, and Bianca Marchetti, the anointed heir, the golden girl, the one the judges supposedly already loved, finished 11 points below the cut. 11 points. Not 1 or 2, not a heartbreaking near miss. 11. The whole distance between a reputation and a skill, measured out in a single number, the exact gap that my braise had been quietly filling for a year. She wasn't close. She had never been close. The closeness had always been me. And the morning I stopped being it, the truth of Bianca Marchetti's actual cooking stood up in front of the people who decide these things and was found, by 11 full points, wanting. And then Theo broke. He'd been watching from the gallery, certain the way only a Marchetti can be, that the morning would resolve the way every morning had always resolved for his family, that the talent would flow where the name needed it to go. And he watched the scores post. My name at the top, Sorel beside it, and his sister 11 points below the line, and I watched the realization move across his beautiful, careless face in stages.
First the certainty, it was a mistake.
Then the frantic recount. 11 points. Surely there was an appeal, a retaste. Surely the judges would see whose name was on the family. Then, slowly, the understanding that the judges had seen exactly whose name was on the family and had scored the food anyway, and that the food was 11 points short and always had been. And then his face did the thing I'd waited 2 lifetimes to see. It cracked, fully, helplessly, in front of everyone.
He made a sound.
Not loud. The small, terrible sound of a golden boy discovering that the brilliance his whole family's story depended on had never lived in his family at all, that it had lived in a diner girl's hands, and that those hands had finally, after a year, refused to keep the lie warm. I knew that sound. That's the thing that stopped me, standing there at the pass. I knew it from the inside. I'd made it myself, in another life, alone, at an empty station, watching my own soul win someone else's future. It's the sound a person makes when the floor they were standing on turns out to have been a person, and the person has just stepped out from under them. Theo was making, in public, by a scoreboard, the exact sound I'd made in private at an empty station a year and a lifetime before. The same sound. The difference was only in the cause. I'd made it because I gave my gift away to a family that taught me it was theirs to spend. He was making it because the girl whose gift he'd assumed he could spend forever had finally kept it for herself. One of us had been the truth under the lie. One of us had been the lie, standing exposed, the moment the truth walked off. And the wheel had come all the way around, in the same kitchen by a number, and I stood there and watched a man learn in the time it takes 3 judges to set down their spoons what it had cost me a whole gray life to learn, that the gatekeeper's brilliance is borrowed, and the lender can always, one day, simply stop. He had lost the stage for his sister, the family's golden girl story, and the secret ingredient that made the Marchetti name taste true, all in that single instant at the board, and not one person moved to comfort him, because the Marchetti warmth had only ever flowed toward the useful, and Theo, suddenly, had nothing left to deploy. I did not go to him. I want that on the record, because it's the heart of who I'd become. I didn't walk over and explain that his sister had failed by the exact weight of the gift I'd refused to launder. I didn't make a speech. I stood at the pass with my name at the top of the board and Chef Vasseur's nod still warm in my chest, and I let Theo break alone in the gallery, because his breaking was not my dish to plate. The only thing I'd done was cook my own food under my own name and decline, for one morning, to be the truth that propped up someone else's lie. The rest he did himself, one borrowed dish at a time. Over a year I'd finally stopped catering. Theo came to find me 3 days later, of course. They always do. He turned up outside my building in the evening, the charm scraped off, hollowed out, and he asked me, lost more than angry, how it had happened. How I'd scored at the top when I was supposed to be the one who stepped aside. How Bianca had failed by 11 when the judges were supposed to love her. He genuinely didn't understand, and watching him not understand showed me the exact shape of the blindness that had ruined us both. He looked wrecked, and I'll be honest that some small part of me felt the plain human pity you feel at a person whose whole map of the world has just been proven wrong. The thing he kept circling back to was the unfairness of it, as he saw it, that Bianca had been so close. Surely that 11 points was a fluke, a bad day. Surely there was a retaste, an appeal. Surely the judges would reconsider for a Marchetti. He could not absorb that 11 points is not a fluke. 11 points is a verdict. It's the whole distance between a name and a skill, and it does not reopen for charm or for surnames or for the family that almost got away with it for another generation. I knew that distance better than anyone alive. I'd been the thing filling it for a year. I'd measured it with my own hands every time I recooked one of Bianca's plates. And now Theo stood on my doorstep discovering, in one evening, the size of a gap his family had spent a generation papering over with my kind of talent, and I felt the strange vertigo of watching him learn in a few minutes the thing it had cost me a whole life and a death to understand, that the gatekeeper's brilliance was always borrowed, and the people they borrowed it from could, one day, simply stop lending. So I told him. Not the rebirth, not the fire, not the braze rising up out of the dark in the last half-second of my first life. The mechanism. I said, Theo, for a year I cooked your sister's dishes for her. I fixed her plates, I laundered my hands through her name, and every time she cleared a bar she cleared it on my food, and you told me it was family. The judges never loved Bianca. They loved a plate she didn't cook. And the one time she had to stand on her own actual cooking, with no one carrying her, she came up 11 points short because 11 points is exactly how much of Bianca was always me. I let that sit. You didn't ask me to help your sister this morning. You asked me to give away my one door, the only way and there was ever going to be for a kid like me, so your family's story could stay true for one more year. And I finally said no. That's not me destroying Bianca, Theo. I never touched her plate. I just stopped cooking it. All I did was put my own name back on my own food. Everything that fell down after that was always going to fall down the second I stopped holding it up. It just took me a whole year, and one no to stop.
He didn't say anything.
There was nothing to say. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, the whole cook I'd always been under the useful outsider girlfriend he'd reduced to a secret ingredient, and I think in that moment he finally understood that he hadn't lost me on final practical day. He'd been losing me for a year, every plate of his sister's I cooked, every time he called my disappearance family, and the final practical was just the service where the bill finally came due. He left without another word. I never cooked anything with his name on it again. And that, more than the board, more than the 11 points, was the moment Theo Marchetti truly broke. Not in the gallery where it was loud, but on my doorstep, quietly, where he finally saw. I took the sorrel stage. I want you to sit in those words, because in my first life they were the great unbearable if I carried into a diner fire, if only I'd kept my own dish, and in my second they were just true. I went to Maison Sorel, the legend, the one door, the apprenticeship that turns a no-name into a chef. And I was good there. Of course I was good there. The only thing that had ever stood between me and the rooms I belonged in was a family that taught me my gift was theirs to spend, and the moment I stopped believing them, the doors I'd been told weren't for me opened like they'd been waiting. I remember my first week in that kitchen, the legend itself, 3 stars and a 40-year reputation, the kind of room a diner kid is supposed to be too small for. There was a moment, on maybe the 3rd night, when the chef, a famously terrifying man who'd reduced grown cooks to tears, tasted a sauce I'd been put on, a sauce I'd quietly fixed because my nose told me it had broken before anyone else noticed, and he stopped, and he tasted it again, and he looked down the line and said, "Who's on this?" And the whole kitchen went silent the way kitchens do before someone gets destroyed. And I said, "Me, chef." And he looked at me, this no-name stagiaire, and he said, "It's right. Keep it exactly there." And that was all, keep it exactly there, but I had to turn back to my station fast so the line wouldn't see my face, because in another life I'd spent 15 years in kitchens where fixing a broken sauce got me slapped down for stepping above my rank, where the nose was a liability and rank was everything, and here, in the best kitchen in the country, the thing I'd been punished for was suddenly the thing they wanted. That's what the sorrel stage actually bought me. Not just a line on a resume, but a room where my gift was finally an asset instead of a threat. It turns out the gift was never the problem. The rooms were. And the stage was the key to the right rooms. The rooms I'd been told all my life weren't for people like me, and I nearly handed that key to a girl who'd have used it to lock the door behind her. The years after were the years I should have had the first time, and I want to tell you about the one that meant the most because it isn't the one you'd expect. It wasn't a star, though there were stars eventually. It was the day I went home to my dad's diner, the 12-stool greasy spoon on the corner the city forgot, the room he'd worked doubles to get me out of, and I didn't come home defeated this time, with my gift in a box. I came home a chef, with money I'd earned and a name I'd built, and I sat my exhausted father down at his own counter, and I told him I was going to buy the building, and fix the gas line and the wiring and the roof, and that we were going to turn his 12-stool greasy spoon into something. Not fancy, never fancy, that wasn't the point, but good, honest food made with everything I'd learned. The diner dialect spoken fluently at last, the humble dishes elevated by hands he'd sacrificed. Everything to train. My dad looked around at his tired little diner, the one he'd apologized for my whole life, and his eyes went wet, and he said, "You came back." And I said, "I came back on purpose this time, Dad. There's a difference." He didn't understand what I meant. I never explained it, but I knew, better than anyone alive, the difference between coming home because the world beat you back to the corner and coming home because you chose the corner, with the whole world finally open behind you and the corner the one place you wanted to plan it. In my first life, that diner was my grave. In my second, I made it my flag. And the gas line, the one that killed me in a life that no longer counts, I had it torn out and replaced in the first month, with my own money, with my own hands on the work order, and I have never told a soul why I cried the day it was done. Some debts you can only pay to a version of yourself that nobody else remembers. We did it in the end. We turned the 12-stool greasy spoon into the kind of place people drove across the city for, not because it was fancy, but because it was true. I kept the counter. I kept the stools. I kept my dad at the griddle on the days his hands were up to it, and I put the braise on the menu, the real one, the elevated one, The Sunday's special raised to the heavens but still tasting at its heart like his tired hands on a Sunday afternoon. And I watched people who'd never have been let into a place like Maison Sorel sit at my dad's old counter and taste the best food of their lives, and I watched my father watch them. And I understood that this was the thing. Not the stars, not the fame, not even the Sorel stage.
This.
The corner the city forgot, transformed by a gift that had nearly died in a box, feeding the kind of people I came from, with my father alive to see it. I had spent 15 years in another life believing that coming home to the diner meant I'd failed. It took dying and coming back to understand that the diner was never the failure. The failure was giving away the thing that could have made the diner shine. And in my second life, I kept the thing. And the diner shone. I saw Theo one final time, years later, and it's the truest measure of how far the two roads ran apart. I was at a food event in the city. One of those bright, loud galas where the whole industry gathers, chefs and critics and the famous names. And I was there as one of the famous names now, the diner kid who'd taken the humblest food and made the gatekeepers eat it, the chef everyone wanted a photo with. And I saw him across the room. He looked smaller than I remembered, dimmer, the careless beauty worn down into something ordinary and tired. The Marchetti dynasty had not aged well. Reputations that rest on a name and not a plate rarely do, and the family had quietly faded as the food world, which forgets slowly but forgets, moved on to people whose brilliance was their own. He was there on the strength of an old surname that didn't open the doors it used to. He saw me. He saw the crowd around me, the easy fame, the unmistakable fact of the career I'd built in the world he'd tried to make me hand to his sister. And I watched the recognition cross his face, and behind it something complicated and old. He came over. He stopped a few feet away and said my name, just my name, Ren, the way they always do at the end. And I waited to feel the old things, the anger, the hurt, the long ache of the outsider who just wanted to belong. What I felt instead was the cleanest, simplest thing. I felt the work waiting for me. There was a restaurant across town with my name on the door, and my father at a corner table on the good nights, and a brigade of cooks I'd trained who actually got to fix the dishes that needed fixing, and a whole life out there with my hands full of it. And Theo Marchetti was standing in front of me asking, in the silence, for a taste, a way back in, a piece of the warmth, and I found I had none to spare, not from cruelty, but because every part of me was finally, fully in use, spoken for by my own life, with nothing left over to launder for anyone who hadn't earned it.
He tried to talk.
He said something about how he'd always known I was talented, how he'd been young and stupid, how things had gotten complicated with the family, how he thought about that year sometimes and wondered if he'd been unfair to me. It was, I realized, the closest Theo Marchetti could come to an apology, a soft, hedged, self-protective thing that still managed to make the wrong he'd done to me sound like a misunderstanding that had happened to us both. And I noticed, listening to him, that I didn't need it. In my first life, I'd have given anything for those words, for the golden boy to finally see me. I'd have built a whole reconciliation on that flimsy half-apology and called it closure. But I'd had my closure years before, at a pass, under my own name, with 3 judges going still over a diner kid's braise. I didn't need Theo to see me anymore. I'd seen myself. So I let him finish, and I didn't argue, and I didn't accept it either. I just let it land in the air between us and dissolve, because it was a dish I hadn't ordered and didn't have to eat. "It's good to see you, Theo," I said, and I meant it the distant way you can mean a thing that's lost the power to hurt you. I've got a service to get back to. And I didn't offer him anything else, not a number, not a place in the part of my life that came after. I gave him a small, real, final nod, not the warm, eager smile of the girl who'd have cooked him anything. That girl was at rest now, gone with the diner that burned in a life that no longer counts. And then I turned and went back to my people, my crowd, my work, and I left him standing there holding an old surname that had finally stopped being enough. I think about that morning sometimes. The hand on my waist, the warm, certain voice, the line, "Give your exam dish to my sister. The judges already love her." And how in one life I said yes, and cooked my soul under someone else's name, and died smelling the dish I gave away, and in another life I said no and plated it under my own name, and won. The whole divergence of 2 lives, the difference between a diner grave and a restaurant with my name on the door, came down to a single word at a prep station on the most important morning I ever lived.
No.
The smallest word. The one I'd been trained my whole outsider life never to say to the family that let me in. And it turned out to be the most honest thing I ever cooked. People think revenge has to be loud. I thought so too. In the dark after my first death, the speeches, the exposures, the satisfying ruin. But the most complete revenge I ever took was to cook my own braise under my own name while the family that had spent a year laundering my gift discovered, by exactly 11 points, what their reputation was actually worth without a diner kid's hands underneath it. I never raised my voice. I never touched Bianca's plate. I just stopped cooking it. And it turned out the whole Marchetti story had been standing on my shoulders the entire time, and the morning I stepped out from under it, it came down by 11 points, the precise weight of the truth I'd been quietly supplying and finally kept for myself. People ask me sometimes, carefully, the way you ask a hard question of someone you suspect has a complicated answer, whether I feel guilty about Bianca. Whether cooking my own dish, knowing it would expose her, wasn't a kind of cruelty, wearing the apron of self-respect. And I've made myself sit with that honestly, because a chef who won't taste her own conscience has no business running a kitchen. Here's the truest answer I have. I did not do one single thing to Bianca Marchetti. I didn't sabotage her plate. I didn't lie to the judges. I didn't touch her food. All I did was cook my own dish under my own name, the most innocent act in the entire building, the exact thing every other student did without anyone calling it cruel. The only reason it exposed Bianca is that her whole standing depended on me not doing it, on me pouring my gift into her name instead of my own. She had been clearing her bars on borrowed truth for a year, and the morning I stopped lending it, the borrowed truth went home, and what was left was just her actual cooking, scored, honestly, 11 points short. That's not cruelty. That's not even really revenge. It's just what happens when the person who's been quietly supplying the missing ingredient finally keeps it for her own pot. The dish that was depending on it falls flat. The people who call a woman cruel for that are almost always the people who are eating off her labor. I fed the Marchetti story for a year. I nearly fed it forever, with my whole life, until a gas line let go in the dark. I am not sorry I finally cooked for myself instead. Keeping your own gift is not an act of war against the people who are spending it. It only tastes that way to the ones who'd forgotten it was ever yours. There's a pot of braise on my stove most days now, in the kitchen with my name over the door. Some evenings after service, when the brigade has gone home, I cook a small batch just for myself and my dad, the cheap cut and the long slow surrender, my father's Sunday special and my whole soul on a plate, and the smell of it fills a kitchen that's mine. And every time it rises up, the wine-dark depth, the time, the 6-hour sweetness. I remember the girl at the prep station who woke 19 with the smell of this exact dish in her face, the dish she'd died grieving, and I'm so grateful she made the choice she made. Because she didn't just win back the sorrel stage that morning. She won back the nose, the gift, the right to put her own name on her own food. She won back the braise. And she never, ever, gave it away again. I think about the gift a lot, now that I've had it both ways, kept and given away. People treat talent like it's a private blessing, a thing that's purely yours to enjoy, but that was never the danger with mine. The danger was always that a gift this useful attracts people who'd like to use it, and that they don't come at you with theft, they come at you with belonging. Theo never tried to take my gift. That would have been easy to refuse. He offered me a family in exchange for it, a seat at the glamorous table, the warmth the milk crate kid had starved for her whole life, and he let me hand the gift over myself, with a smile, calling it love, calling it family, calling it generosity. That's the trap they set for the talented poor. Not theft, but the slow exchange of your gift for the feeling of being let in. And the only defense against it, the only one, is to know, all the way down where it can't be argued out of you, that the gift is yours, that it was always yours, that no amount of belonging is worth laundering it through someone else's name. It took me dying to learn that. I'd give a great deal to have learned it without the dying. But I learned it, and I kept the braise, and that has made all the difference. I died the first time smelling the dish I never got to cook. I intend to die the second time, an old woman in a kitchen that's mine, smelling a dish I've cooked 10,000 times, for my father, for my people, for the diner kid I was, who finally, after everything, got to keep what was hers. Same smell, both ends of two lives. The first time it was the smell of everything I gave away. This time it's the smell of everything I kept. And the only thing that ever stood between the two was a single word, said calm as a pilot light at a prep station on a morning I'd lived once before. No. It cost me a family I'd starved to belong to, and it bought me back my whole self. The nose, the gift, the braise, the name on the door, the father at the corner table, the friend at the pass, the rooms I'd been told weren't for me. Given the same prep station, the same warm certain voice, the same hand on my waist asking me to pour my soul into someone else's name, I would say it again 1,000 times.
No.
And then I'd turn back to my pot, and I'd cook the truest thing I know how to cook, and I'd carry it to the past myself, under my own name, the only name it was ever meant to wear. That's the whole of it. A diner kid, a freak nose, a humble braise, and a single quiet word that split one life into two. Taste your own cooking. Keep your own gift. Carry your own plate to the pass. And never, ever, let them put someone else's name on the truest thing you make.